Hello, I'm Professor McCoy. Today we're going to talk about tyranny. Now this is a topic I went over somewhat in the context of Plato's Republic in a previous lecture. We discussed the various forms of how a society can function and how a person can be put together, and how it can gradually evolve into something tyrannical. So if you're interested in that, the link to that lecture is in the description. It's also in the playlist if you haven't seen it. But if you've been following along, and or if you're in my class, you'll remember some of the examples that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to rehash a few of those. But the case in point that I'm going to focus on in this lecture is the case of Alfie Evans in the UK. This is very recent as of this recording. And this was the case of a toddler, so less than 2 years old, who was at a hospital in the UK, who was had some sort of undiagnosed brain disorder, as I understand it. I'm not an expert on the medical end of this, so I'm having to sort of interpret what various doctors are saying. So anything I say in terms of the medical procedures, take with a grain of salt, of course. But as I understand it, there was either no diagnosis or there was a dispute with respect to the diagnosis. But it was eventually settled initially by a British court that Alfie would be disconnected from life support against his parents' wishes. Now, under normal circumstances, this would be perhaps a difficult decision, certainly tragic, possibly even the wrong decision. But that's not what I'm meaning to discuss now. Setting aside whether this was the right decision or the wrong decision, I want to focus on how it was decided and the process that followed from that. So the initial decision by the court was a kind of taking of agency. There's a cat down here somewhere. Sorry. It was a kind of taking of agency from the patient and from the parents. In essence, it was an exercise of judicial power in an attempt to grab judicial power, to take judicial power. Now, what happened next displays this more fully, and it brings us into this conversation that Plato has about the nature of tyranny. So what happened after there was a diagnosis is naturally Alfie's parents appealed to further and further high courts in the UK. The UK government repeatedly denied their request to maintain life support, and then further denied their request to transport Alfie to a hospital in Italy, Bambino Gesù, that had offered a different treatment or offered a different diagnosis, had given some reason to hope that Alfie might survive. So what is at question here is whether Alfie's parents would have been able to attempt to save his life, as opposed by the decision that was made by the British court. Now, under most circumstances, it is hard to see why a court would prevent someone from taking any chance they could in a situation like this. Even if the odds of survival are incredibly low, even if their diagnosis or their suspected diagnosis or what have you, even if it was correct, and Alfie was going to die anyway, even if additional life support would not benefit him in either way, which is a large assumption. I would think an incorrect assumption, but even if that is correct, a chance of survival is a chance of survival, and if it's being offered by someone else, why would that be prevented? We have to ask. This is where Plato's description of the tyrant enters our discussion here. So according to Plato, what happens that gives rise to tyranny, whether in a state or whether in an individual, is a transition from seeing instrumental goods as good for the sake of something else to seeing them as ends to be pursued. So especially this is the case with respect to power. And he talks about political power especially, but this can apply to anything that constitutes an instrumental good, or anything that constitutes something that's only for the sake of some other further good. Power is the prototypical example of a purely instrumental good, something that's only good for the sake of what it gets. And to treat it as an end in itself is to mistreat that good. The same can apply to money. Money is another perfect example of this sort of thing. So this might even be a more comfortable example for us to think of, is treating money as an end in itself rather than as a means for getting some other good things is clearly a misuse of money. But the same thing applies in this case especially to power. So what Plato sees happening in any case where a person or a society devolves into tyranny is that power is treated as the end rather than as a means. Power is what is being ultimately sought after, and so the person or the government seeking power winds up in conflict with reality, say. Because the reality with respect to what power is for is that it's for getting things, right? So the reason you seek power is that so you can get something for it. You can use it to get something. The reason you seek money is so that you can spend it on something that's actually valuable. The Scrooge McDuck character, which I mentioned in the previous lecture, that dives into a pile of money and just has the money for the sake of itself, is nonsensical. And it's a misunderstanding of what money is for. It's a misunderstanding of what power is for as well. The same thing applies. So what happens when someone starts pursuing an instrumental good like power for the sake of itself rather than for the sake of what it can get? Well, it starts to pervert other means. Other means that ordinarily would be perfectly good things. Working to obtain something, even perhaps governmental structures, social structures, interpersonal interaction, what have you, begins to serve, instead of their own functions, they begin to serve that drive for power. And so we see what happens is that the person seeking power will start necessarily to seek it by unjust means. What do I mean? Well, unjust means in this context are further and further slides away from reality, or away from the good way of obtaining things, and even away from the good things they're trying to obtain. When power becomes an end in itself, it eventually becomes the only end that the person can see, or that the government can see. This is because everything else winds up being subverted and winds up being subsumed into that goal for this aberrant quest for power. Because no other good can survive having power as an ultimate end, because power is naturally, understood properly, is naturally an instrumental good. It's good for the sake of other things. It's good for the sake of getting good things. So other good things necessarily will have to take a back seat to the obtaining of power, to the obtaining of these instrumental goods. Because if they are sought for, and if they're given even a moment of primacy, if they're even entertained, then those become the ultimate goal, because they're intrinsically good. They're something that can be pursued in a just way, can be pursued in an understandable, reasonable way. And the pursuit of power can't afford that. So this is when the pursuit of power becomes the only objective. And this is where we wind up being, as I mentioned before, opposed to or at war with reality, and opposed to actually seeing the world as it is and actually treating things as they are. It inverts our way of thinking so that we see things only for the sake of power rather than as good things. For example, if we look to the British courts in the Evans case, what we see is a fear of, say, losing power, or a fear of power being subverted, or a fear of this pursuit of power being properly subsumed into some greater purpose, being properly subsumed into the welfare of the child, being properly subsumed into a respect for human life, which isn't present. Because if it is present, if any of these more valuable goals present themselves and actually are considered worthwhile, then the quest for power evanesces. And the powerful, or those that seek power as an end in itself, cannot allow that, because it gets in the way. So to the concrete case, if we look at the judge, or the various judicial officials responsible, if we look at those responsible at the hospital, because I don't want to impugn the entire staff or all of the doctors there. I'm sure there perfectly well may have been good people working there. But those responsible in this case, those responsible for the prevention of the Evans family from pursuing other means, preventing the Evans family from undermining the official decision, say. And even the other governmental structures involved. What we see is first and foremost a prevention of outside agents, whether those are the international community, whether that is the government of Italy, whether that is the Catholic Church who became involved, or whether that's Alfie's parents. What we see is a fear that they will undermine this quest for power, and that they will undermine the decision-making process that leads to this, that has this power as its goal. So if we look at this from the perspective of, say, a tyrannical judge, a decision's been made. Someone wants to change that decision. Now, ostensibly, it's for the good of the child, right? That's been the justification. The justification has been that it is in Alfie's best interest that he be allowed to die. Now, if someone else were to intervene in the process, prevent that from happening, and show that that justification given is vacuous, that it would in fact be in Alfie's best interest to be given a chance to live, so suppose he'd gone to Italy and lived, the decision would have been undermined. There would have been no longer a justification, a post hoc justification, fine, but a justification for this decision. So a change couldn't be allowed from the decision that was made. Because to change one's mind, to admit error, is to give up some measure of power to that which changes one's mind, whether that's the facts of the case, whether that's another person intervening, whether that's a competitor for power, even in a pure struggle of power. To change one's mind in a case like this is to relinquish power. And if power is the ultimate goal, that can't be had. Now, what about other elements of this case? I mentioned that this pursuit of power, this tyrannical nature of whether a person or whether a government, will always involve a conflict with reality, and so will wind up having to suppress conflicting statements. And it's the same way we see as someone changing the decision by providing alternatives. It isn't just providing alternatives, it's providing criticism that we see as being a problem as well. So for instance, we heard the story, if you were following this case, we heard the story of the hospital chaplain being removed from the hospital for criticizing the decisions of the doctors and reminding them that what they were doing was wrong. Now, if they were right and if they had no reason to be concerned, they would have had no reason to remove him, no reason to remove this voice that's speaking to them. But we see this in a tyrant. We see this impulse to remove things from one's field of vision that threaten this image that the tyrant has created. Right? This image of being correct and this image of pursuit of power for its own sake. If there's some reminder that there's some other good to be pursued, then the pursuit of power gets short-circuited and we can't do it anymore. So we have to push aside these other concerns. Another example of this. We saw several posts, primarily on social media. That's the most visible example of this, of local police, British police, threatening people who would post in opposition to the official decision on social media with criminal prosecution. You see several cases of this. And there would be no reason to suppress this kind of dialogue or this kind of criticism, except what we've seen. We see this suppression of criticism, the suppression of any hint of reality breaking through. Because again, the tyrant can't embrace reality. Because reality will say, power isn't a goal to be pursued, power is a means. Power is something that you use to get something else, right? So power is the ability to do things. The ability to do things is for the things that you're doing. It can't simply be for the sake of itself. It necessarily, if you want to put it in, say, grammatical terms, it has an object. It necessarily has an object. So what we see in this process of needing to suppress things that conflict with the tyrannical narrative, this narrative of power, what we see here is I hate to say a slippery slope, but a slope of behavior that inexorably leads from one to another. So a single just action, this centerpiece of injustice, of pursuing power for its own sake, will always necessarily lead to further unjust actions. Right? We see, for instance, that a single lie, even if it's innocuous, if you're going to maintain it, will necessarily involve further lies, whether you're repeating the same lie or whether you're filling in other elements of this false narrative. Eventually this can lead to more and more unjust actions and more conflict with reality. Once you deviate from what's real and what's good initially, you'll wind up deviating more. We see this in fables, we see this in real-life examples, and this is the perfect real-life example of a powerful judge who makes a decision and is supported by the surrounding governmental apparatus by upfrontly being in conflict with reality. And this leads step by step to more and more tyrannical actions. Simply because one action can't stand alone. You need other things to support it if it's something is so in conflict with reality as this is. So tying this to another example, this is one that I mentioned in the other class lecture. It was the example of the Roman Emperor Caligula. And this is, incidentally, also involving Britain. So if you didn't see that example, or if you're not familiar with it, this is when Caligula attempted to lead his armies to conquer Britain, which had never been conquered before by the Romans. But when he got to across the sea, across the Channel from Britain, his troops almost rebelled. So what could he do? Well, he certainly couldn't simply give up. Right? He has this image to maintain, both for his troops and at home, of being this all-powerful emperor, this emperor who would one day be deified. And you can't be an all-powerful emperor if your troops turn around when they encounter something arduous, when they encounter the unknown. So, he reacts in a few ways. With violence, by decimating his troops, killing every 10th man. And he reacts in a way that we would see as insane. He has his troops declare war on the god Poseidon, declare war on the sea itself. And he has his troops essentially attack the sea with their weapons, collect seashells as trophies to bring back to Rome. But what's the point of all this? It seems insane. Why would an emperor declare war on the sea? Well, because his troops can't deny him. And his people can't deny him. If Caligula wants something done, then he needs to have his troops embrace the same twisted reality that he has. It's similar to saying that here's something that you know to be incorrect, right? Something you know to be false, but I'm going to force you to believe it. It's a show simply of power. It's showing that this is my reality. This is the reality that I'm imposing upon you, my soldiers, and the people of Rome. Right? So he's imposing this reality of being at war with Poseidon and collecting trophies. He's crushing their spirit, in a sense, or crushing their rationality would maybe be a better way of saying it. He's crushing their ability to distinguish, even just vocally distinguish, reality from a delusion. So he's implementing this and he's saying, this is something that I have to do as an emperor. So Caligula needs to do this, which seems insane. But he needs to do it because he's already chosen to pursue power as an end. The point of the conquest wasn't for any particular reason other than the power and glory of Rome and the power and glory of the emperor, most importantly. Doing something no emperor before had done, or attempting to at least. And if that's the goal, if the goal is power as I'm explaining it to be, if that is the case, then it will inexorably lead to more and more and more tyrannical actions. And we see this back home as well, where countless Roman emperors, going back at least to Tiberius, escalated to more and more and more tyrannical actions in order to maintain this power, in order to maintain this pursuit of power. Because once you have one lie, it will always lead to more. And that's what we see in the Evans case. Once we have one action that's for the pursuit of power, it's for the pursuit of making sure that we have control of what's going on. Now, maybe the initial decision was made for medical reasons, but if we're to give the benefit of the doubt to the judge and to the NHS and to everyone involved, fine. But once the decision was made, it couldn't be changed. That's what tells us that we have a tyrannical regime. That's what tells us that power is the ultimate goal here, is the ultimate pursuit. But you see the point. One tyrannical action will lead to more inexorably. It'll lead to this war with reality, and anything that threatens to force us to see reality as a threat to the accumulation of power, and it has to be stopped. So this is why Plato thinks that the tyrant is a slave. The tyrant, the one who pursues power for its own sake, the one who pursues power and even gains power over everything, is a slave. Because in this pursuit, they have no option other than to continue to do more and more and more unjust and tyrannical things in order to maintain this hold on power. The only other option is to relinquish this pursuit. And for most tyrants and for most tyrannies, that's impossible. It involves a kind of self-destruction. It involves relinquishing the only thing that one has in terms of an identity, the only thing that one actively pursues. And this is why we see Plato saying that tyranny is slavery. It's equivalent to death. Here, we see the tyrant or the tyranny, whether this is a person or whether this is a state. Either way, we see the tyrant or the tyranny led inexorably along this path to destruction, led inexorably along this path to more and more unjust things until it falls apart. And we see this, the impossibility of carrying along this route. For example, we see this in Socrates' trial as recounted by Plato in the Apology. We see Socrates at the end of his trial, after he's convicted, what everyone expects him to do is to apologize in the modern sense and to beg for exile over death, but he doesn't. He doesn't. He essentially gives the Athenian people a choice between putting him to death, someone who they know is not deserving of death, because they expect him to ask for exile and they expect to give it to him. They give him a choice between putting him to death and effectively letting him off with a small fine that his friends would pay for him. So he gives the Athenians a choice to either admit that their whole political process, their whole judicial system is built on not the pursuit of justice, but the pursuit of power. To admit that by letting him go free and to admit that the entire trial was pointless. Or to kill an innocent man in order to maintain their system and thus to show what has gone wrong with it. And it's impossible. It's an impossible choice. The Athenian assembly have to put him to death. They cannot allow the illusion to be shattered. And that's what we saw. That's what we saw with Alfie Evans. We see him the victim of this process of this dilemma between admitting that there's a fundamental flaw in this pursuit of power on the one hand, and on the other hand, allowing an innocent, in this case an innocent child, to die. They had no choice. Well, They had a choice. But the alternative was watching their tyranny crumble. And a tyrant can't do that. So that's essentially a short illustration of a tyrannical person or tyrannical government through the lens of how Plato describes this process happening, which I think is still accurate to this day. And I'll note that he very closely described many of the early Roman emperors hundreds of years before they were born in this section of the Republic. He described the process that we see continued to this day of tyrants maintaining power for power's sake, and it leading to a spiral of injustice and a war with reality. So hopefully this has lent some insight to the decision-making process of the, let's say, non-clinically psychopathic, or as Plato would say, the mentality of the tyrant. Then hopefully given some insight into Plato's description of tyranny as well. With that, there will be a link in the description to the previous lecture which I mentioned, which I encourage you to watch. It also goes into the various other things that can go wrong in a society and in a person that leads to this. And it also describes, of course, Plato's particular views on the subject, which I think are still prescient to this day. They're very accurate. So with that, I'll leave you all until next time. Bye.